terre.
When you're young and you grow up, you naturally learn from the land, growing up from your environment, hunting, and
C'est
from
dans
nature.
le respect.
It's in the respect of your surroundings.
Et c'est un enseignement.
And it's a teaching.
C'est la nature qui t'enseigne, te donne les enseignements.
It's nature that teaches you and gives you that teaching.
Et on le remercie en faisant attention à lui, en le respectant.
And in exchange, we give thanks to nature and Mother Nature by respecting her
Ce que
and
je
taking care.
porte aujourd'hui, c'est ce manteau de chasseur de caribou avec des motifs pour dire merci au caribou qui s'est donné à toi pour que toi tu puisses vivre.
What he's wearing right now is caribou skin with motifs to show respect to the caribou for giving its life and for coexisting with it.
Et le Innu, Quishpet Nantem, Winite Henago Sihok Shahimyo, Emyo Chendo Emyo. Tout de suite en se levant, tu es déjà en prière.
Just by getting up, waking up, you're already in prayer.
Tu sens l'air,
You smell the air, you feel,
l'écoute, la vue,
listen, you see,
le sens du
you,
toucher.
you sense.
Et ça, c'est, tu l'apprends tout le temps, jusqu'à temps que tu grandis avec.
And you listen, you learn throughout your life with this teacher, with these teachings.
C'est-à-dire, quand tu marches dans le bois, quand tu fais du canot, quand tu fais des raquettes, et tu marches dans la neige, tu entends la neige qui te parle. Tu fais
When you're out in the snow, in your rackets or canoeing, you hear the snow talk to you.
Ouais. Et tu es toujours en perpétuelle prière, disons.
You're in perpetual prayer.
Et c'est ce que peut-être qu'il faudrait faire durant les prochains jours, mais dans un autre sens, qui est vers s'unir ensemble. Tout le monde veut dire discuter et avancer vers un but commun qui est le respect et l'écoute.
And that's what we should be doing for the next few days, is gathering, learning, and uniting.
C'est ça, ce genre de prière-là qu'on fait maintenant, présentement.
And this is the prayer that we're doing now.
Fait que, tindishka maintenant, minendene yo abmeduit, magtibetadag mando, ci hen magzutino, ci gamwe abstawe, upmeji stak, meji tuit, meji abstak. Beaucoup mettent un peu l'ego de côté et penser avec le cœur pour qu'il y ait un équilibre. Et je les remercie.
Remove your ego and think with the heart instead. Thank you. Merci.
Merci.
It's we began this in a very in the ways of our people. The song to remind us of our presence on this earth, and we began with the acknowledgements to the land and the ancestors who are here on this land. And we also began by introducing ourselves to this land, and that we come in a good way, with a good heart and a good mind. We've structured this we've tried to structure this in a very traditional, Indigenous way, in which we usually gather in a circle. And when we have something that we're looking at, that we need to address, we need to change, we need to think about and for the future. We usually gather and we place that, what we're wanting to shape, in the middle of our circle. And that's where we speak to. So we're not arguing about anything, but we're shaping and changing and trying to understand from many perspectives what it is we need to do. And we're gathered together here at this conference on higher learning. Why? Because Indigenous peoples have been excluded throughout this planet in areas of higher education. And this needs to change. We need to find a new way to learn together, to learn in a way that is meaningful to us as Indigenous people. I'm grateful to the planners of this conference to open this 190 minutes to Indigenous knowledge and learning. Because there are Indigenous peoples throughout this planet that can make an impact on higher learning in the ways in which we learn, the ways in which we teach, in order to be able to maintain good relationships with one another and with the earth. And so we have a number of speakers who will speak to that center. And the first person I want to invite is Dr. Lori Robinson, Mahingigan Saging First Nation, who is the first executive director of the Indigenous Education, Advanced Education and Skills Council in Ontario, Canada. It is the first time in our country of Canada that Indigenous institutions can give accreditation to their students without having it, without it coming through another institution. And this is a huge step for us in our country. And I'm just so grateful and blessed that Dr. Robinson would come to share with us what they have learned, what they are doing, and what they are learning. Laurie?
Ogima Benejik Indigenous, Hunters Point Donchba, North Bay Donda, Makwa Dodem, and Shnabe Kwe and Dao. My name is Ogima Benejik, but here I'm Lori Robinson, and I'm very, very happy to be with all of you today. I thank you very much for hosting us, for hosting our delegation of our singers, our elders, our speakers who are here today, and for some of us, our families. Thank you so much. I'm honored to contribute to this important conversation on Indigenous perspectives on higher education. I will share some of the experiences of the work of the organization I lead in using an Indigenous lens to transform long-standing systems of higher education in the province of Ontario in the country of Canada. In Canada, Indigenous peoples are diverse in their languages, culture, history, and identity. In fact, the peoples are of many different nations and life ways. Colonization and the imposition of Western forms of education has attempted to destroy Indigenous identity, languages, culture, knowledge, families, and communities. It did this by outlawing language, culture, knowledge, and life ways, among other things, and by removing children from their families to receive education in a foreign system and a foreign language. The Indigenous lens was assaulted and has suffered tremendously. Today, many Indigenous youth in Canada do not have access to education, nor the same quality of education as other non-Indigenous youth in our country. The impacts of the attempted removal of the Indigenous lens combined with a lack of access, has negatively impacted, no, in fact, prevented educational opportunities and outcomes for successive generations of Indigenous people. In one particular jurisdiction, however, in Canada, there is hope. In the province of Ontario, a law was passed in December 2017, and that law is called the Indigenous Institutes Act. That law was co-written, it was co-created, co-developed between the Government of Ontario and Indigenous people. The goals, the intents, and the worldviews of both sides achieved a new law in higher education. In most provinces in our country, laws concerning education in general are often created that establish education systems. However, in this case, the Act did not create the Indigenous Institutes and the Indigenous Advanced Education Skills Council. No creation there. It recognized them. It recognizes that they are Indigenous owned and Indigenous controlled. The law also recognizes the necessity of quality assurance in higher education as being absolutely essential, and as such, it recognizes the Indigenous Advanced Education Skills Council. Our organization has a very important role in returning the Indigenous lens to higher education. We are responsible for affirming and approving institutions and programs using standards and benchmarks. The standards and benchmarks used to review the institutes themselves were developed firstly with a foundation in the work of the World Indigenous Nations Higher Education Consortium, represented here today by Dr. Elmer Guy, who we'll hear from shortly. So the standards then to review institutes themselves, first we worked with WINHEC, and secondly, we had to include additional provisions that were required by the Government of Ontario on matters of student interest. The inclusion and reflection of Indigenous knowledge and lifeways in the governance, administration, and operations of each institute is very important, and it's looked for in the standards. We, our organization and the institutes, we're developing a new higher education system, and community needs to be part of systems building. Engaging community is critical to building education that will meet the needs of the learners, the institutes they attend, and the communities in which they live. This is how we are developing our standards and benchmarks for certificate, diploma, and degree programs. This development process for program standards and benchmarks is an initiative of our organization. As a very first step, we developed an engagement process for the organization, and we call that process dialogues. These dialogues provide an opportunity for us to listen and learn and help inform the development of standards and benchmarks on the experience and knowledge of Indigenous institutes and their communities. Since we began these, since inception, I believe which was July 2019 or 2020, we have now conducted 15 dialogues. We prepare verbatim transcriptions of those sessions. We share those initially with all of the participants and then publicly on our website. Further to that, using qualitative analysis, we prepare outcome documents from those transcriptions. And again, we share these with the participants and then we post them on our website. The establishment of that public-facing documentation from dialogues allows us to capture and share information. And perhaps we may find other things to use that information for. We place emphasis on applying Indigenous lifeways in the development of a quality assurance framework, and we do so in a manner that is reflective of the diverse Indigenous communities in Ontario. Our standards and benchmarks that we've put in place situate the learner and their well-being at the center of the delivery of quality education. By doing this, then, our approach focuses on the learner. So when asked what our council is here to do today, I summarize by saying we are ensuring and assuring the quality of Indigenous institutes, and the quality of programs that they wish to develop with an Indigenous lens. This, my friends, is an Indigenous lens. This is the contemporary voice and experience of Indigenous institutes and communities they belong to and serve. Assuring quality is a priority for us. However, there's much more to do to develop this pillar of higher education in our province. I just want to mention to you that important to our work in our organization is to bring life to the principles articulated in Article 14 of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. That article provides that Indigenous peoples establish and control their own educational systems, provide education in their own languages in a manner appropriate to their methods of teaching and learning. Last month, a delegation from my organization attended the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. And we acknowledged the disconnect between the Permanent Forum's mandated area on education and Sustainable Development Goal number 4 on higher education. We now have an opportunity to establish a bridge that can ensure interactive participation of Indigenous peoples both in the Permanent Forum and at UNESCO with respect to higher education. SDG number 4, indicator 4.3, needs to be consistent with Article 14 of the Declaration to ensure that quality technical, vocational, and higher education is accessible to Indigenous peoples in a manner appropriate to their languages and lifeways. We are in early days, and I want to acknowledge the experiences, advocacy, and commitment of many elders, parents, children, and leaders to make change in higher education. Thank you all for listening. Miigwech.
Glory. Our next speaker is Dr. Marie Baptiste, an amazing and incredible academic who was at the University of Saskatchewan as a professor and is now with the University of Cape Breton. Indigenous people who are studying the Indigenous world in academia will always seek and find Dr. Baptiste's work to guide them and to inform them about how to continue to respect their knowledge of the world and of their Indigenous world in the academic arena of today. And she's been guiding us and working with us, and she sends this message from her home place. And I'm grateful to her for being able to do that, to using technology to be present here today with you. Dr. Baptiste.
Greetings, bonjour to the delegates at the UNESCO World Higher Education Conference in Barcelona. I'm honored to be one of the speakers on the Indigenous Perspective Circle on Higher Education. I am Marie Baptiste, a member of the Mi'kmaq First Nation, a member of the Bonadec First Nations, a retired emerita professor and continuing researcher at the University of Saskatchewan, and now special advisor to the Vice President and Academic Provost at Cape Breton University on decolonizing the academy. Incorporating Indigenous content into universities has been part of a growing movement in post-secondary education in Canada and has merged into various kinds of indigenization of the university. Such progressive changes have been transformed by many pedagogical approaches around the terms used, such as incorporation, integration, or infusion of Indigenous content into Western education systems. Over the past 4 decades, several mandates and inspirations for inclusion of Indigenous content has occurred in Canada, from the Royal Commission Report on Aboriginal Peoples, the Constitution of Canada's affirmation of Aboriginal treaty rights, and the University of Canada's 13 Principles for Indigenous Education, and more recently, the TRC calls to action, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action to universities to be part of a needed re-education of all citizens in Canada in breaking the cycles of oppression and racism in Canada. All universities have responded with developing their own Indigenous strategic plan initiatives and urging action and changes in all their units. Most universities have increased Indigenous faculty hires, added new Indigenous course requirements for students in various professions such as law, education, health, and social work, and some universities have, like the University of Winnipeg, have required all students to take at least one Indigenous studies course regardless of their academic program. Each of these have been part of the indigenization movement in post-secondary education taking place across Canada. University professor at University of Saskatchewan, Professor Adam Godfrey, has pointed out that while adding Indigenous content through these multiple university approaches is generally a good thing, there are several considerations that should be thought out before taking on large-scale re-education of the student population. He cautions universities to consider their assumptions leading to the purposes of these courses. Students' discourses and learning of Indigenous people's lives and contexts of their oppression have often led them to blame Indigenous people for their situations and not the colonial power structures imposed on them. To unlearn their social constructions built on Eurocentric colonialism and racism, and then relearn new ones takes more than one class. Such knowledge building may then lead to an awareness of Indigenous people that often leads nowhere beyond the one class. Settler knowledge about problems created by settler colonialism is also unsettling and takes more than one course to change minds, attitudes, and actions in the future. Furthermore, requiring students to take required Indigenous courses are often met with resistance and pushback, and the adding of one off course takes away from the resourcing of Indigenous studies for students who want to pursue a specialized and expanded program of learning in various aspects in Indigenous studies and other courses elsewhere. Many Indigenous scholars have critiqued this approach, speaking to the distinctiveness and distinctions of Indigenous knowledge systems as having their own distinctive ontology, epistemology, and axiology. I refer to Sean Wilson and Stan Wilson and Yanga Porta in 2004. And the problematic directives that the terms imply in terms of content, teaching, and learning of Indigenous knowledges that appears as a seamless addition to disciplinary knowledge traditions. These are very different knowledge systems and may do harm to Indigenous survival by the appearance of their apparent seamless integration. What then is lost when Indigenous knowledges are appropriated as symbolic content for inclusive education? Are there better ways to address Indigenous knowledges from their own Indigenous ontologies, community-activated learning styles, and places teaching learning methods that align better with the affirmation of Aboriginal and treaty rights or the alignment of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People with Indigenous or educational institutions? As a senior Indigenous scholar, now special advisor to the Vice President Academic at Cape Breton University, I have begun to see the challenges and the barriers and indeed the advisability of offering Indigenous knowledges as integration and infusion, and think that decolonization of the knowledge systems is a needed development. And decolonization then is the deconstruction of the knowledge systems, the colonial structures, and indeed the reconstruction of Indigenous knowledges so that the commitment and alignment of Aboriginal and treaty rights can be actualized in and through education. With now the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, it's now more important that higher education be included in the needed changes to support Indigenous people's rights to their knowledge systems and to have them the basis of their educational practices. Indigenous knowledge represents a very different kind of knowledge system that is the foundation of Indigenous people's survival of their languages, their sustainability in place, and the survival and transmission of their cultural traditions that hold that knowledge system in place. Indigenous knowledge is just not a content area for Western disciplinary knowledge systems of universities to appear inclusive and progressive in public education, but is an important and vital part of societies and nations that need to be maintained and survive for 7 generations. Decolonization then requires that institutions make major reforms and rethink the foundations of their learning, the languages they're using, the assumptions of what counts as knowledge, and how to hire and promote faculty based on those knowledge systems. Indigenous faculty then cannot be hired simply for their check in the box of Indigenous identity, but need to have connections and real experiences with Indigenous knowledges and traditions in communally activated learning. They must then have different merit and tenure and promotion standards than those of Western knowledge systems and be allowed to grow in and with their Indigenous knowledge traditions, cultural and spiritual knowledge of their community, and be rewarded for supporting the self-determination of their communities, not just their own education. Indigenous knowledges are importantly different, and I hope that in your discussions today that you will be persuaded to the need to advocate for decolonization of education and the manner by which Indigenous knowledge may be pursued ethically for their own benefit and not just for the institutional hierarchy. I want to offer in closing the need to identify new forms of accreditation for higher education when it involves Indigenous knowledges. And I would point to the World Indigenous Nations Higher Education Consortium, which you can find by looking up WINHEC.org and look to the bottom and where it says higher education, and then in there you'll find the accreditation standards and begin to see what kinds of ways in which Indigenous knowledges may be supported through accreditation when it is accredited by Indigenous peoples programming and Indigenous peoples. And with that, I say thank you for giving me this opportunity today to speak to you. I bid you well in your discussions further throughout the day. Thank you very much.
Marie. And we're so fortunate that right now, today, we have Dr. Elmer Guy from the Navajo Technical University in the United States here. And because he's the co-chair of the World Indigenous Higher Education Consortium and WINHEC that began when Indigenous academics got together a number of years ago, beginning in 1986, and they finally formed in 1993 and have been working worldwide on furthering accreditation. And so, Elmer, I would like you to come to share your words with the group.
Thank you. Yate, I have a presentation, a PowerPoint presentation I put together. This is just to show, this is one of our commitment. And the person there I'm walking with is Dr. Jill Biden. And she was there. And the reason why I mentioned her is I think it's important for people that are high in the federal government, as well as UNESCO, to hear us sometimes. So that's the only reason why I think that's why I put this picture in. Next slide. About 370 million to 500 Indigenous people live in the world today. And Indigenous people make up about 5% of the world's population, but account for 15% of the world's extreme poverty. Life expectancy is 20% lower than the rest of the world's population. Still, indigenous people protect 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity, and yet education outcomes among indigenous people are among the worst compared to other populations in the areas where they live throughout the world. Next slide. I take two things from this and from other data. Indigenous people are marginalized around the world. This means that the needs in indigenous communities tend to be greater than in communities that are their neighbors. Indigenous people have a promise of all humankind and the earth that has not been acknowledged. There's a reason 80% of the world's biodiversity is found within the indigenous country. Indigenous cultures and spirituality are a powerful force that can lead to good in the world. Next slide. Education is a keystone in addressing indigenous communities' needs. Teaching and learning can lead to improved lives for individuals, families, and indigenous communities, leading to better economic situations in the future. But the classroom is not the whole sum of benefits that flow from strong education systems, especially in higher education. Next slide. One of the most important aspects of indigenous education is, however, sovereignty. At the heart of educational progress for indigenous peoples is the power of sovereignty. If a people have control over their own land, their own lives, sovereignty of the original people of the land, they can make decisions rooted in their beliefs, culture, attributes, and values rather than those of the values of the majority society that surrounds them. Next slide. At the heart of what makes indigenous people indigenous is culture, language, and spirituality. And here's a picture of Raymond Redhouse, one of our medicine folks that teaches the nest studies at Navajo Technical University. Preserving and growing indigenous language, culture, and spirituality. Spirituality is one of the part of educational enterprise. At Navajo Technical University, our philosophy states that through the teaching of HEIS, which is thinking, the Nata, planning, Ina, implementing, and Sehasan, reflection, students acquire quality education in diverse fields while preserving cultural values and gaining economic opportunities. Next slide. Next slide. I always say that you build from strength to meet challenges and resolve weaknesses. The persistence and aliveness of our cultures, languages, and spiritualities is our strength as indigenous people and indigenous institutions. Next slide. Preserving and strengthening culture is only one aspect of education for indigenous communities. Equally important is the higher education role in providing solutions to community challenges. In health education, indigenous people can become nurses or even doctors if the community has health challenges. Higher education can become one of the answers to the inability to keep medical professionals for more than a few months or years at a time. Indigenous people love the communities they come from, will dedicate their lives to their people, and if they are given a chance to earn proper credentials through the Indigenous college or university. Next slide. Degree ladders can entice students to earn technical certificate and end up with a graduate degree. Here's a person, Dwight Carlson, one of our students, started out as a carpenter and now has a graduate degree in environmental science from University of Georgia. Next slide. By developing intellectual properties through research initiatives, a better economic future can be achieved. Here we have a project in material science with Harvard University, and that incorporates into the laboratory and classroom activities in chemistry, physics, engineering, and biology at NTU. Next slide. Higher learning institutions can develop world-class laboratories and research centers, aiming to make Indigenous nations the next Silicon Valley. The Center for Advanced Manufacturing at NTU is one of the premier laboratories of its type in the United States and has helped the tribal college movement develop research and education in fields like engineering, metrology, which is study of measurement, materials testing, manufacturing processes, and material science. Employment for students and graduates is provided through research projects, partnerships with private sector companies, national laboratories, and selling product and services. Capstone projects through partnership encourage entrepreneurial development by Navajo and Zuni students in all of the above fields that I mentioned. Next slide. This is our Business Incubator Center, and we all try to take what we do with academics and transition over to the business world, and this is one of the pathways. Next slide. At Navajo Tech, we offer different programs, from certificates, could be culinary arts, to police academy, to a bachelor's degree, master's degree in Navajo language, culture, and leadership. And so we have that flexibility to do what we think our needs are in our communities. Next slide. The World Indigenous Higher Education Consortium, which I co-chair, is an important tool for helping grow and strengthen Indigenous education worldwide. An accreditation authority that helps validate Indigenous higher education institutions, similar to what was mentioned earlier. And we have the memorandum of agreement to help Canada in this effort. We also have a World Indigenous Nations University. Yearly conferences are held where ideas about Indigenous higher education are discussed. And this year it will be held in Fond du Lac in the United States. Projects concerning furthering Indigenous higher education throughout the world, leadership opportunities, the ability to meet with Indigenous higher education leaders from around the world and visit other campuses. Next slide. The WINHEC's Accreditation Authority. The Accreditation Authority was founded upon the diverse Indigenous language, culture, beliefs, traditions, protocols, and law and practices that provide the epistemological and pedagogical basis for the institution's schools programs under review. The primary focus of the WINHEC Accreditation Authority is the internal congruence and cultural integrity of the institution's schools programs under review. The Accreditation Authority promotes Indigenous research that is respectful of Indigenous controlled education institutions, as well as programs and mainstream institutions of higher education that promote the language, culture, and practices of Indigenous people they serve in the appropriate way. Next slide. This is the global membership of our country, and it's in Taiwan, Canada, Norway, USA, New Zealand, Peru, Alaska, Hawaii, and hopefully Africa to join soon. Next slide. The World Indigenous Nations University, WINU, aims to address the challenges faced by Indigenous peoples across the globe by providing access to a system of higher education that is culturally and professionally astute and aligned to a commitment to advancing Indigenous development through education. WINU primarily offers co-joint undergraduate and graduate degrees designed to encourage practice and research within the Indigenous communities of the students who enroll. Next slide, the WINHEC Charter. We gather as Indigenous peoples of our respective nations, recognizing and reaffirming the educational rights of all Indigenous peoples. We share the vision of all Indigenous peoples of the world united in the collective synergy, and self-determination through control of higher education. We commit to building partnerships that restore and retain Indigenous spirituality, cultures and languages, homelands, social systems, economic systems, and self-determinations. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. Thank you, Dr. Williams, for getting us here. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker will speak on Indigenous knowledge and the future of higher education in India. And speaking to this topic is Dr. Sonhara Mintz, an Indian academician. Her doctorate was in computer science. She's an Adivasi from India, and she's the vice chancellor at Sidok Kanu Murmu University. And I really welcome you, Dr. Mintz.
Thank you. An Adivasi Vice Chancellor from a state university in the land of Jharkhand, which is land of forests, stands here bringing Johar to one and all here. I not only represent the university I'm heading, but I also today have put on the traditional dress of Santals. I wear the jewelry of a community in Chhattisgarh. The earrings and these jewelry are made by the children who go to the school in the school time, but they come to community school and are engaged in traditional learning, and the proceeds of these go to support their school. And so, coming from a land of complexities, I bring greetings, and I'm thankful to Dr. Lorna Williams for this session in which I'm included too. I would like to recognize individuals and the family who have been instrumental in making it possible for me to also be part of this session, talking about indigenous knowledge systems which are being discussed in India and future of higher education in India. As an Adivasi, I would talk about this term. As an Adivasi person, to do a reality check of higher education in India for the Adivasis is a challenge. Next. This one. Tribal people in India are known as tribal, but internationally are also clubbed with indigenous peoples because of ILO Convention 169, and are also connected with indigenous populations across the world because the way the scholars, the sociologists and social anthropologists have defined us. In India, of course, the literature would talk about the primitiveness, uncivilizedness, backwardness, and so on and so forth. But as per the 2011 census records, we constitute an 8.61% of population, not less than 700 distinct tribes in all. In India, we are also called as Janajati, which means community of peoples. So people with distinctiveness, relatively egalitarian, but having absence of complex political structures, strong and functional kinship bonds, cooperation, integral territorial integrity, cultural and linguistic distinctiveness, lower levels of technology, but our philosophy towards livelihood and economy is rather not understood by the outsiders, and therefore, as per their interpretation, they have gone ahead and done the definitions. Next. Next slide. However, in India, the melting pot, the land of melting pot, has also made all sincere attempts for mainstreaming of all peoples, including the tribals. Tribes which cohabit the northern Himalayan regions to the southern tips, from the west, central, and eastern part, are also being an area of or a region of conflict for the reasons that natural resources are either above the land as forest or under the surface of the land as minerals. And therefore, by the Dikus, the outsiders, it has been a constant struggle and therefore have been systematically and historically been pushed geographically to the places which have been difficult for non-tribals to habit. And therefore, it's been not only an experience of geographical marginalization, but thereafter also systematic marginalization in terms of social exclusion, and also the education policies and likewise the other policies which basically do a check on access, equity, and affordability. Things which are solvable problems remain unsolved. However, with whatever education, at least the two generations of tribals across the land may have gained, the outcomes of their education, such as literature, their deliberations on their religion, culture, medicine, livelihood, food practices, games and sports also, everything is labeled as subaltern. And so, how much has mainstreaming been done by education? That's a question I'm faced with when I look at education in India. Next. I have some data on the left-hand side. The tables talk about some state-wise gaps in terms of literacy, of average of all the population, the scheduled tribe, male and female. If the first three states, they don't surprise us, but then I would like to draw the attention of two states, Mizoram and Meghalaya, which are almost above 90% tribal in population. Look at the gaps. They are in minus. But look at the gaps of so-called progressive states, also such as Orissa. Look at the gaps. Okay, coming to the most surprising is Kerala, which is one of the most literate states. Fortunately, here the claim is only 94%. But look at the gap in terms of scheduled tribes, the literacy of scheduled tribes. And given all this data, my university, Sidhu Kanu Murmu University, stands in more than 60% tribal populated district, offering admission to 38,200 students in 2021 to the undergrad programs. And so this university has a responsibility. And therefore, I stand here with full responsibility of heading such a university which should be accountable to the population in which it has been situated. And therefore, next slide. Therefore, inclusion must be the only way forward. And inclusion with the spirit of change for knowledge and not exclusion anymore, and nor hostility in the corridors of teaching and learning and research. In India, we have constitutional safeguards, which are political and social safeguards for making space for the scheduled tribes. these are letters but need to be implemented in spirit, so that the students and teachers and employees of all cross sections of the society have their share of the space. Likewise, cultural inclusion must be the next one, which has been built into our recent national education policy, which stresses on mother tongue education. The question here is, will all tribal languages be part of this bandwagon, so that the last child of a tribal family also gets education, primary education, in his or her mother tongue? And so cultural inclusion. The last but not the least, institutional inclusion. Having multidisciplinary tribal knowledge hub or documentation hub, because my university could be thought of in a special cultural zone in order to be doing the needful. A good number of decades, the forum has talked about knowledge for change by engaging with communities. And so the community was given, but now is the educational institution willing to take from the community? And therefore, the lowest part, the figure, it's between the university and community. One arrow goes from university to community, saying knowledge for change, but from the community to the university, change for knowledge. And this may do a full circle of knowledge co-creation, and that could lead to institutional inclusion too. Next, please. And so, in order to do that, the validation or verification of what comes out becomes a question mark. And in order to face that, probably in inter-institutional collaboration, leveraging mutual strength could be one of the ways to go about. Having UNESCO chairs also for tribal and indigenous knowledges in such countries where a percentage of indigenous population or tribal population is very high. Although in India, the population percentage of population is only 8.61 of the 1.3 billion. And so India holds the largest number of tribal or indigenous population. Therefore, it is, and having such diversity also need not have complexities, but then probably common prototypes could make a way. Knowledge for change and change for knowledge, if are built into the accreditation and ranking systems, universities would therefore be more accountable in spirit rather than just letters and the reports. And therefore, I would like to close with these contributions towards my vision for the future of higher education as co-creators and engaging with each other, universities like mine, situated in communities where it can learn a lot and to continue to learn and refine and go forward. Aima sarhau, adi sarhau. Thank you very much. Johar.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mintz. I think that she's pointed us in a good way. And the next speaker is Dr. Elizabeth Kane, who is Huron-Wendat from Quebec, and she'll share with us. I love her title. Governance in Indigenous Research and Education. To get there, you must forget what you know, and then listen to me. Dr. Kane.
We first have a small 4-minute video to listen, and then I will come back talk with you.
Le désir aussi de voir mes...
The wish to see my community or my nation emancipated and reseize control over its own dreams and aspirations.
Le comité des sages est le central. Alors le cercle rouge au centre, le cercle...
This red circle in the center, this red circle behind, the First Nations work, and the wise people provide the system of values. Everything else is all around.
Ça, c'est vraiment les valeurs sur lesquelles a travaillé le comité des sages. Comment ça influence?
Start how to evaluate, using the wise people's influence on how to evaluate programs, how to influence the choice of partners, and how to take on conflict resolution from an ethical perspective.
Ça, c'est ce que la Charte doit faire.
And so this is what we're supposed to be doing. It puts us back in relation with the world, with the nation, an interdisciplinary, cultural, intersectoral relation. They went into reservations. There was a sanctification. We need to be part of the world network again.
Merci. Je voudrais d'abord...
I should like, first of all, you were saying that you liked my title very much, And in fact, it's Lucien Saint-Ange's idea, who is part of the Wise Men's Committee. And what this basically says is that if you want to work with us, if you want to change the world of research, you absolutely have to forget everything you've learned. You have to simply clear the decks and start all over again, altogether. Rethinking entirely the way in which research is done with Indigenous people. And that's why, if you've got, sorry, we can't hear the speaker. And so this is the work that we're doing. This is the results you've seen here, where you saw people working with about 40 people from the First Nations who were trying to rethink what Indigenous research could be and how you can, as I said, clear the decks and rethink entirely how we can decolonize research. So I wanted us to pay a bit of attention to this model. I know it went by pretty quickly, but the 4 models that we saw. I was at a big conference in the auditorium just now, and I was saying that all the big elements, the challenges, the things we're talking about that are important for future education need to be applied to the thoughts that are emerging in these models. And this can really correspond to a revolution in the world of education and really meet these major challenges. I don't have time to go over all of this with you here, but I did want to say that the governance model, how we can think about giving power to Indigenous people and the governance of education. This is a form of governance which is focused on horizontal relations, on decentralization of power by shared leadership, consensus. These are all concepts which can truly respond to several of these major challenges. We also have modelization of values which are meant to be driving our activities, integrating past knowledge, working side by side on the basis of this knowledge so as to propel ourselves into the future. We are all dealing with these basic postulates, but each of them requires changes in the way that we act and work. The third model, which was modelization of an Indigenous holistic dynamic, putting the whole world into these dynamic relations, interdisciplinary, intersectoral, intercultural, etc., to put the Indigenous world in the sphere of this dynamic. This is also a way of rethinking education. And as one of the speakers said in that conference where I was present, we're always talking about the future of education, but you also need to be able to look at the past. The past has a lot of answers for us, and the past of Indigenous people has particularly many answers. So in one of the model trees you saw, one of the things was to look at the roots, which were our knowledge, and to propel ourselves into the future on that basis. So this is an answer which can come from some of these crossroads at which we presently find ourselves. The gentleman here spoke about Indigenous knowledge and ecosystems, for instance. And I'll conclude by saying that there was a report that we put together 2 years ago where we saw, without necessarily understanding why, that the only unaltered ecosystems were the ones managed by Indigenous peoples. And so I think it's terribly arrogant to believe that there's a supremacy of white thought in all of these issues and simply to ignore all the other systems of knowledge which exist. So we have to be able to get back to those. Thank you very much.
Merci for that. Our next speaker is, will speak on the urban Inuk perspective. And this is an important perspective. It's a perspective of people who live away from their homelands and the perspective of a graduate student. And that's it's a very important word for us to hear. Caitlin?
Ulukut, Elispiangava, Anana Kimilgan, Anana Chiach, Eva Adams, Kudrak, Mujayunga, Nanunak Lakwamin. I am the tiniest speaker. Good afternoon, my friends. My English name is Caitlin Herchak. My Inuk name is Elisapi. I am Inuk on my father's side from Kudrak, Quebec, and Rankin Inlet, Nunavut. I am an Adams. I'm related to the Wat, Ipili, and Lamb family. On my mother's side, I'm Celtic and Viking. And I was raised outside my territory. I was born and raised in the Kwangin territory, which is all the way in Victoria, BC. And I got to where I am today is because I have one hell of a strong mom. And the coolest lady that I get to call mom. And when I was growing up, my mom would go to all the schools I was attending and say, my daughter is Inuk, you treat her well, you teach her well. And as I got older, I realized I went into further my studies, and I kept seeing folks who didn't quite look like me or didn't quite talk like me or couldn't really pinpoint where my homelands were. And I thought, this is interesting. And I would ask my teachers, where is the Inuk perspective? How can I learn my language? How can I see my people? And my teachers would tell me, you go back and you learn that on your own, then bring it into the classroom. But then I thought, isn't this an interesting opportunity for higher education institutions to create space for those of us who are displaced off of our territories and foster community connection and the ability for us to be able to see our homelands, hear our language, practice our culture and traditions, and hear our songs. And then remember that everybody's a teacher and everybody's a learner, and this includes our non-human kin. So in closing, I would like to tell you a story that's my favorite story from my territory that I learned just a couple of years ago, because I'm still on this journey to discover who I am, where I come from, and our way of being, knowing, and doing. So it's the story of Nululiak. And Nululiak is one of our very sacred beings across the circumpolar. She's a very particular spirit. So the story of Nululiak is she was the most beautiful girl in the village, and men would come from all around asking for her hand in marriage. Nululiak, you're so beautiful, please be my wife. She'd go, no thank you, I'm not interested. The man would go away. A new man would come, Nululiak, I'll get you the best fish. No thank you, I can do it on my own. She was a very independent woman. Finally, Nululiak's father said, you have to marry, I'm getting older, and I can't provide for our family like I used to. Please, marry the next man that comes through. Nululiak said, no thank you, I can provide. I'm an independent woman, I can do this. Then one day, Nululiak's father went out hunting, and a very, very handsome man came to their village site and said, Nululiak, I promise you the best food, I promise you the best meats, the best furs, please be my wife. Nululiak went, oh my, you are the handsomest man I've ever seen. And she said, I would like to wait for my father in order so we can have this marriage in a good way. The handsome man goes, no, if you want to marry me, we must leave now. Nululiak, hesitant, reluctant, packed her things and went on with the handsome man. They traveled very far, and they traveled into an island that Nululiak's never been to before. And she was like, okay, well, he promised me the best furs, he promised me the best meat. I should be well taken care of. Then Nululiak's father goes back to the village site and sees that she's gone. And he starts to search for her, because it's a little bit longer of a time that she's away than she usually was. And then Nululiak was only being fed fish by the handsome man. And she went, "Hey, you promised me the best meat. You promised me the best furs, and all you're giving me is fish." And then she would sit on the beach and cry because how much she missed her family. She would cry and cry and cry. And then Nuliak's father could start to hear her crying and started to search more frantically for his daughter. He follows the sounds of her cries, and he gets in his kayak, and he starts to kayak out into the ocean, following the sides of Nuliak. He finally finds her on this beach, and he says, "Daughter, come with me, we'll escape." And Nuliak gets into the kayak with her father, and they start to leave, but then the handsome man saw, and he got angry, and he transformed into a bird, and he flies over to Nuliak's father's kayak and starts flapping his wings and cocking and scratching at the kayak, trying to get her out. Nuliak's father goes for his knife and kills the bird man, but he didn't know that he had bird friends watching in the skies, and they saw that he killed his friend, so then they flew down and start clawing, pecking, and then Nuliak's father realized in order to save his daughter, he has to throw her overboard. And so he takes Nuliak, he throws her overboard, but then she grabs onto the side of the kayak, and her father goes for the knife, and he cuts off her fingers. And as she falls down to the sea, she drowns, but then she comes back as a supernatural being because her sacrifice and her fingers turned into whales, fish, seals, and narwhals that actually feed my community. So take that medicine how you would like, and remember that Nuliak, she's always watching. And our shamans would have to transform into fish and swim down to her and love and take care of her and brush her hair to release all the sea life. And Kuyamami for listening.
Thank you for that story. Our next piece is from the Inuk, the people of the North, who have been working to establish their own university, because in Canada, the people of the North have always had to go to the South to get an academic education. And it's time to build a university in the North, and this is their voice.
Inuit say, knowledge is not knowledge until it serves to improve the common good.
Tamna atulokawud, kinguvahi lokawud, ihumaging imalugid, hibukman ayoktugut. Hibukmati chinilugayavina, atung ichamalugud, kingunia atung ilaglugo, hibukmutakawini lukawid, na apihin nayakman.
Inuit Nunangat is a geographic space within Canada. It constitutes 1/3 of Canada's landmass and is the homeland for Canadian Inuit. Nunangat University is a concept that Inuit have been talking about for 20 to 30 years. At the heart of this concept is self-determination in higher education. We would like to create a university that has Inuit society, Inuit educational aspirations, and Inuit specifically at the core of the institution and all that the institution offers. Part of the reason why an Inuit University is so needed is the opportunity for Inuit to not run into barriers and also to not have to leave our homeland in order to pursue higher education. We also recognize that we are not alone as Indigenous peoples with barriers and challenges to higher education, but because of our location geographically in the world, we have barriers that many other people do not.
personally, having to leave my community and my whole support system to attend an institution that's run based off of westernized values and principles just didn't really align with my thoughts or experiences. And that was pretty difficult for me, not being able to really see a reflection of myself made it hard for me to visualize a future where I could best serve my community and best serve myself and my potential. Rather, Inuit can be experts in our own field, in our own knowledge systems. Someone who, recently finished post-secondary studies, I now see the importance of inclusion in higher education, and I think the Inuit Nunangat University is key to provide future students that chance to showcase their potential and for Inuit to finally have that autonomy in an academic setting.
Atung ilugo Inuit kaway mayato kangat puna atung ilugo atong nilukalo awit Inuit tigud hivuk mulang itugud Inuit ileko hingana nungumeana.
We need all the support we can get from as many people as possible. We need the minds of Inuit and those who are sympathetic and supportive of this initiative to come together and make the most of the opportunity that we have here.
And their experience. I would like, we have 1 minute, and I know I didn't give you any opportunity to ask questions. I know that you might have many, but take it and use it to have a conversation with others so that we can have inclusive and respectful education for Indigenous peoples around the world. I would like, as you leave, I would like to invite Derek and Kylie to come back up to sing us away so that we can leave safely and continue our travels and our journey in a safe and good way. Thank you very much, and all the best to you as you continue on your journey.